Good to see everyone this morning. Happy Mother's Day to all you mothers in here. Happy Mother's Day to you, Mom, if you're watching. I'll call you later. So my wife's like, you call your mom? I'm like, they don't get up early on Sunday. They don't get up early. I'll call her later. So anyway, all right. If you have your Bible, turn to 2 Kings chapter number 23. I'm going to apologize in advance because there are a lot of names here. And eventually, I know I'm going to mix up a name. There are a lot of names here, and there are changing of names in the process. And so eventually, I'm going to call somebody by the wrong name. So just, if you can, just forgive me in advance because I'm sure I'm going to do it. But in 2 Kings chapter number 23, in verse number 30, and his servants carried him in a chariot dead from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem, buried him in his own sepulchre. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him, and made him king in his father's stead. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he put the land to a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land, of every one according to his taxation, to give it to Pharaoh Necho. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Zebudah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by his servants the prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And I'm going to stop reading right there. So we know that Judah as a nation is very close to being taken into captivity. And so we're going to basically have four kings after Josiah that are going to be king. Some of them are not going to be king very long, but we're going to have 4 kings, and basically it's about 22 years. If you look at it, 22 years and 6 months, because 2 of them only reigned for 3 months apiece. But the first thing I want us to notice here is Jehoahaz. The people took Jehoahaz to be king, and normally the way it happened was they like to pass it down to the oldest son, but we know that's not always how it worked out. But the Bible tells us plainly that the people took Jehoahaz to be king, and so he had an older brother who was Eliakim, who eventually is going to be king, who is called Jehoiakim. But they took Jehoahaz to be king, and so the Bible doesn't tell us why they took Jehoahaz to be king. And so you could speculate, was it because Jehoahaz was a fighter and Eliakim was not a fighter? Was it just because they liked Jehoahaz better? But for whatever reason, they chose to have Jehoahaz to be the first king after Josiah. And if you think about it, I mean, there probably was not a whole lot of thought going into it beforehand, because, I mean, here's Josiah is, and he's cruising along in his kingdom, and everything's going really good, and in that one rash decision, that one rash moment where he says, hey, you know what, Pharaoh Necho's going to fight someone else, but I'm going to go out and fight against him. And not only am I going to go out and fight against him, I'm going to disguise myself, which is what we talked about last week, disguises. I'm going to disguise myself so he doesn't know it's me, because it almost, again, like I said, I feel like that Pharaoh Necho said, hey, look, not only am I going to fight against him, if he does come out here, I don't want you to kill him. And so he had to disguise himself so he could even come out and fight. And so that was a rash decision, and I'm sure that no one in Judah was sitting there thinking, you know, if something happens, because he was only 39 years old, if something happens to Josiah, who should we make king in his place? And I understand that, you know, some people are planners. My wife's a planner. She likes to plan and have stuff laid out. I kind of go by the seat of my pants with about everything I do. I just, you know, I make decisions on the fly, and I'm much happier when I make decisions on the fly than having to sit down and write stuff out and plan it all out. And honestly, I'm also, just my personality is that I also don't, it makes me feel like I'm being constrained. If we make a plan and I have to follow the plan, I feel like I have to be constrained. And I'm a free spirit at heart. And so anyway, but, you know, like I said, my wife is a planner, and some people are planners, and surely, you know, in a kingdom like that, you know, that it's not like these days with modern medicine and stuff like that, where we're like, hey, you know, anyone gets sick, there's a high probability that, you know, that there's some life-saving medicine. You can get someone to a hospital in time, whether that's a life flight helicopter, an ambulance. You can get someone to a hospital really quickly. But back in those days, I mean, you didn't have any of the modern medicine. You had all kinds of, you know, sicknesses that could take place that they couldn't do anything about, and you just got sick and boom, you were gone. And so they I don't think they would have had a plan, but if someone did have a plan, you know, they could have been like, hey, who would we rather have? You know, Josiah's got these sons right here. He's got at least 3 sons, and of these 3 sons, which one should we choose? Which one should we have? And a lot of times it was the king that was setting up the next king to take place. But it doesn't look like any of that happened. It just looks like, hey, this happened, and the people of the land said, this is who we want to be king, Jehoahaz. Now, the interesting thing about Jehoahaz, which, I mean, really, I mean, it happens to all of his sons. All 3 of his sons that end up reigning, not a single one of them turned out like their father. Not a single one of them. It doesn't look like, Brother Croft, they had 1 ounce, I'm going to call it spirituality, not 1 ounce of spirituality in their bodies. Not a single ounce. And not only did they not have a single ounce of spirituality, it doesn't even look like they had enough sense that Manasseh had, that whenever he got in trouble, he's like, hey, wait a second, maybe I should repent and call on God, maybe he'll do something. It doesn't even look like they had that much sense. It looks like they lived with Josiah, and again, it says in here that he, in verse number 32, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. And so, again, I thought about it here, and you think about how old he is. He's only 23 years old. He's only 23 years old. His father was 39. His father was 39 when he died, so take away 23 from that. That's, 16? He was 16 when he was born. His father started reigning when he was 8. So he never even knew his grandfather. He never even knew his great-grandfather Manasseh. He didn't even know these people. But yet he chose to follow in their footsteps instead of following in his father's footsteps. He chose to follow those people. He chose to follow their actions. And it says, right there I read it, it says, according to all. And so here, if you think about it, here Josiah had taken such care whenever he cleaned up Judah, and he even tried to clean up Israel. He'd taken all that care to do that. And what does his son come in and do? As soon as his son comes in, as soon as he comes in and takes over, he's only reigning 3 months. He's only reigning 3 months. And so in that 3 months that he reigns, he brings all that bad stuff back in. No doubt there was Baal worship that got brought back in. No doubt he's like, hey, if you want to have your wizards again, if you want to have your familiar spirits, if you want to have those things were allowed to come back in. He allowed this stuff to take place in Judah, even though his father had worked so hard to clean it up. And so that was in his heart the whole time. It was in his heart the whole time. The whole time his father was reigning, the whole time he could sit there and look at how his father was blessed, the whole time he was looking at it, he's like, I don't want any of this. I don't want any of this. I don't want a single bit of this. If I'm ever in charge, we're going to change things around here. If I understand as a son, I'm sure there are times where you look at your father and you're like, well, you know what, I'd do it differently. And sometimes things need to be done differently. But a lot of times it's because, they don't need to be done differently. It's just that you don't understand the consequences of doing them the way you think they ought to be done. And so here's Jehoahaz, and he's a young man, but he doesn't have an excuse. Again, when Josiah took over, we could have gave him an excuse that, hey, you didn't serve God. Why? Because it was, 55 years of Manasseh and 2 years of Ammon, and Josiah takes over at 8 years old, and he really didn't have anyone that just come in and took him and trained him, and it took him 8 years to really say, hey, look, I'm really going to search after God when he was 16 years old. It took him a while to get things figured out, but it never says that he did evil. Even at 8 years old, he never said that he did evil. He just didn't know, hey, we need to clean this stuff up. But as soon as he heard the word of the Lord, he's like, hey, we got to clean this place up. We're doing this wrong. Here's a young man that grew up basically his entire life. His father was at least serving God, and then for the last 13 years of his life, so from the time he was 10 years old until now, he'd heard that word of the Lord. He saw his father clean Judah up, and he understood that God had blessed his father because of that. But yet all of that he discounted and said, "No, I think I'll go the way of Manasseh. I think I'll go the way of Ammon. I think I'll go the way of other kings of Judah that it did wrong." And because of that, again, sometimes we think we just have all the time in the world. And I know we're in the older adult class, and it's a little bit, it's a little different. But, if we went over there to some of the classes in the other Sunday school building and be like, hey, how much time you got? And, they're going to be, I'm going to live till I'm 80. I'm going to live till I'm 90. And you just don't know. You just don't know. I was listening to something this week, and then I listened to a podcast, and then there was a special thing, and I'm like, well, a special thing? I'm like, what is this? So I clicked it. It was just a few minutes long, and one of the people in the podcast had a brain bleed, and they got them to the doctor soon enough, and they did save their life, but they're not 100% sure. What the effects of it are going to be. And so you just don't know. You just don't know from week to week, how much time you have. And I'm sure that when Jehoahaz took over, he's like, hey, I've got a lot of time. I've got a lot of time. I'm going to set this thing up, and I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. And never even took into account that even back in Hezekiah's day, Isaiah told Hezekiah, hey, there's going to come a day. There's going to come a day where sons that issue out of you, they're going to be taking them down. They're going to be taking them down to Babylon. They're going to be taking them down to Babylon, and they're going to put them in captivity, and they're going to make them eunuchs, and they're going to take everything you got. everything you got, and it's going to be down in Babylon. And took no heed to the warning from God through his men of God. And so here comes Pharaoh Necho. Here comes Pharaoh Necho up, and again, it appears that Josiah, in his rash decision of, hey, I'm going to go out and fight against Pharaoh Necho, and Pharaoh Necho's like, hey, I don't have a fight with you. I don't have a fight with you. Just, I'm going up. God told me to go up here and fight these other people. God told me to go up and fight these other people, and so I'm going up to fight them, and you just need to stay out of it. And so Jehoiakim's like, Jehoahaz, I told you I was going to do it. Jehoahaz is like, hey, you know what? I'm going to avenge the death of my father. I'm going to avenge, so we're going to go fight against Pharaoh Necho. And Pharaoh Necho says, I had respect for your father, but not for you. And so it says in verse number 33, it says he put him in bands in Riblah, in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. So here he comes up and they fight against each other, and Pharaoh Necho puts him in bands. He takes him captive. He takes him captive, and he's going to end up taking him out. He's going to end up taking him to Egypt. And so he's going to end up making his brother Eliakim. He's going to make him king instead. But I want you to look in Jeremiah chapter number 22, and you don't have to turn if you don't want to. I'll read it to you. But in Jeremiah chapter 22, it says, verse number 1, "Thus saith the Lord, go down to the house of the king of Judah, and speak there this word, and say, Hear the word of the Lord, O king of Judah, that sittest upon the throne of David, thou and thy servants and thy people that enter in by these gates. Thus saith the Lord, execute ye judgment and righteousness, and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the oppressor, and do no wrong, do no violence to the stranger, the fatherless, nor the widow, neither shed innocent blood in this place. For if ye do this thing indeed, then shall there enter in by the gates of this house kings, sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots on horses, he and his servants and his people. But if ye will not hear these words, I swear by myself, saith the Lord, that this house shall become a desolation. For thus saith the Lord unto the king's house of Judah, Thou art Gilead unto me, the head of Lebanon. Yet surely I will make thee a wilderness, and the cities which are not inhabited. And I will prepare destroyers against thee, every one with his weapons, and they shall cut down thy choice cedars, and cast them into the fire. And many nations shall pass by this city, and they shall say every man to his neighbor, Wherefore hath the Lord done this unto this great city? Then they shall answer, Because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord their God, and worshipped other gods, and served them. Verse number 10, Weep ye not for the dead, neither bemoan him, but weep sore for him that goeth away, for he shall return no more, nor see his native country. For thus saith the Lord touching Shallum the son of Josiah, and this is Jehoahaz, king of Judah, which reigned instead of Josiah his father, which went forth out of this place, he shall not return thither any more. But he shall die in the place whither they have led him captive, and shall see this land no more. So again, we were reading about Jehoahaz, and he goes against Pharaoh Necho. But not only did he go against Pharaoh Necho, he went against the word of God. He went against the man of God. And again, like I said, sometimes you think you have lots of time. You think, I've got all the time in the world. I'm fine. I'm going to live till I'm 100 years old, and I've got all the time in the world to get right with God. And sometimes God gives you one warning. He gives you one. He gave his father one warning. It says that Pharaoh Necho, when Pharaoh Necho, it was the word, it was from God. That, hey, God sent him up to do this, and he said, hey, don't mess with me because I'm doing what God wants me to do. And Josiah said, no, I'm going to mess with you anyway, and it cost him his life. And so here is Jehoahaz, and now he's king, but he's king and he's only 23 years old, and like, hey, I've got all the time in the world. I think about it. I started at the place I work when I was 23 years old. And at 23 years old, I didn't know that I'd still be here 22 years later, still doing or actually 23 this year, 23 years later, still doing the same thing. But there are decisions I made even back then that I'm like, that was ridiculous. There are things that I'd done even back then that I'm like, man, I wish I could go back and change that. And you never know how much time you have. You never know how much time you have. And so here's a man that God gave a warning. Now, I'm sure there was probably more, but we read right there where God gave a warning that says, hey, if you do this, you're going to sit on the throne. But if you turn against me and serve other gods, I'm going to take you out. And so what happens to him? God kept his word, and God took him out in that thing right there where they took him. And so at the end of verse 33, it says that Pharaoh Necho put the land to tribute 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And so he puts this land to tribute, but it's going to be his brother's problem. It's going to be Eliakim's problem, who's going to become Jehoiakim. It's going to be his brother's problem. It's not going to be his problem. Why? Because Pharaoh Necho said, this one right here, we're not going to be able to deal with this one right here. You're going to see that Eliakim, he's going to say, all right, you put the land to tribute, I'll comply. It almost appears like Jehoahaz is like, I'm not going to comply, and Pharaoh Necho's like, that's fine, I don't need you to comply. I don't need you to comply. And so in verse number 34, it says, Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah's father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, and took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. So when he takes Jehoahaz away, he's 23 years old. He takes him down to Egypt, and the Bible doesn't tell us how long he lived in Egypt, but it doesn't appear that it was very long. At 23, at the most 24 years old, it appears that while he was in captivity, he died down there in that captivity. And so now you have Eliakim, and so in Eliakim, his name meant God sets up or God raises. But Pharaoh Necho changes his name to Jehoiakim, and it's Jehovah raises up. Now again, if you remember in verse number 29 of this same of chapter 23, it says, in his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and the king Josiah went against him, and he slew him at Megiddo when he had seen him. Maybe it was in Chronicles. But anyway, it talks about how Pharaoh Necho said, hey, God told me to do this. God told me to do this, and it almost appears like that here Pharaoh Necho is changing his name, and he's like, hey, just don't say God, because your name's Eliakim, God raises up. Don't just say God. We're going to change your name to Jehoiakim, which is God, which is Jehovah. There's only one God, and Jehovah, he is God. And so he changes his name. But he says, hey, look, I'm putting the land to tribute. And we read it right there. It's 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Now, if you think about that right there, if you think about where did most of the silver and the gold and stuff, where did that gold come from? They took it from the Egyptians. They took a lot of their silver and their gold. They took that from the Egyptians. After all the firstborn were slain, the Egyptians were like, take our stuff and get out of here. Here's our gold, take our stuff, and y'all get out of here, and we don't ever want to see y'all again. And so we know when Aaron made that golden calf, even when they were in the wilderness, he made that golden calf. He took the earrings out of their ears and made it out, and that was gold that they'd taken from the Egyptians. And so here we have the Egyptians taking their stuff back. But it says that, and Jehoiakim, verse 35, and Jehoiakim gave silver and gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land. Again, it wasn't like, hey, we're just going to take it out of the king's treasure right here. And a lot of times, which is going to happen again, but a lot of times, whenever the Assyrians came against them and said, hey, you're gonna pay us or else, what they do, they'd run down to the house of God and they take all the gold and stuff out of the house of God and send it down to pay them off. Even though it never worked, and they'd come back again anyway. But we know by this time a lot of the stuff that had been gold was replaced with brass in the temple. A lot of the stuff that had been gold, whenever they made it again, they made it out of brass. They didn't make it out of gold. But he said, I want silver and I want gold. I don't want your brass. And so he taxes the land. He taxes the people. And so now the people are having to suffer. The people are having to suffer. The people who were at one time rich are now getting their stuff taken away. And it's just a precursor to what's going to happen. It's just a precursor. And sometimes God sends little things. He sends little things, and it's like, hey, if we don't change our ways, God's going to send bigger things. God sent a little thing in here, just, hey, we're being taxed by the Egyptians, but we know from Isaiah's prophecy, it's not the Egyptians they need to worry about. It's the Babylonians who they need to worry about. That's not the Egyptians they need to worry about. But here God is allowing Pharaoh Necho to take some. But eventually what's going to happen is it's not going to be Pharaoh Necho, it's going to be Nebuchadnezzar come up. And so we'll skip verse 36 and verse 37 of this passage right here, because it just says he was 25. Again, he was the older brother. He was not. The people took his brother Jehoahaz. But now here we have Pharaoh Necho setting up a king for Judah, and they set up Jehoiakim. And I believe I think this was actually the first time in Judah's history. Not Israel, but in Judah's history, I believe this was the first time that it didn't pass down from father to son. I think every other time in Judah's history, it went from father, and whenever he was taken out, it went to a son. It didn't go to a brother. I think in Israel's history, it did pass sideways before, but I think in Judah's history, this is the first time it ever went from a brother to a brother and not from a father to a son. But if you look in chapter number 24, in verse number 1, it says, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up. And again, like I said, God has warned them. God has sent prophets. God has sent men of God to warn them. And God is not only judging kings of Judah, he's judging the people. Why? Because the people were so willing to turn back. As soon as Josiah was no longer king and Jehoahaz becomes king, it almost appears that even the people were like, whew, I tell you what, I'm glad that's over. And you see it in our days. You see it in our days where people are like, I tell you what, I can't go to church down there. Well, why can't you go to church down there? It's just too tight down there. You just don't have any freedom down there. You just can't. I can't do the things that I want to do when I'm down there. And they never look and say, hey, maybe that's a problem in my heart or your heart between you and God. They're like, no, it's just them people. They're just too tight down there. And so here you have Nebuchadnezzar about to come up, and God had warned those people over and over and over again. And Nebuchadnezzar's not playing games. He's not playing games. And so when he comes up, he's coming up with the intent that he's going to rule and reign the world. And so in verse number 1, it says, in his days he came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. And so we're probably 8 years into the reign of Jehoiakim, and Pharaoh Necho's not the boss anymore. Pharaoh Necho, and it may not be in this passage, it's probably in the Chronicles, but basically Nebuchadnezzar come up and he clipped Pharaoh Necho's wings. And he sent him back to Egypt, and he took a bunch of his territory and said, hey, from here to here, this is now Babylonian territory. That, you stay where you're at in Egypt, and I'll leave you alone, but you stick your head up out of Egypt, and you come across here, and I'm taking you out. And so now here is Judah, and again they went from Pharaoh Necho, who was basically just saying, hey, y'all send me your silver and your gold and we'll get along just fine, to now here comes Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not content just to take the silver and gold. He's about to take the people. But in this passage right here, it says for 3 years he served him. And again, he'd been serving Pharaoh Necho before, so he was kind of a king in name only. He was kind of a king in name only because really, he wasn't truly in control. But you would have thought, again, like other kings, he would have said, hey, we've got a problem here. Maybe had he read back his history and said, hey, what did they do in Hezekiah's day whenever the Assyrians were coming up against them? What did they do? Maybe I need to look at doing something different. Maybe we should look at doing something different. But that's not what he does at all. Instead of saying, hey, here's Jeremiah coming up and warning me. Here's Jeremiah coming up and warning me. Here are the other prophets coming up and saying, hey, you better get right with God. You better change your ways, or God's going to take you in. God's going to put Judah in captivity. Instead, you never see a point, whether in this passage or in Chronicles when you read it, you never see a point where he says, hey, you know what? Maybe we should change our ways. Even Manasseh, when he was taken into captivity, said, hey, maybe I ought to change a few things. Maybe I ought to look at how I'm living. Maybe I ought to change a few things. But it says it never shows us a time where he changes his ways. And again, let me go back to verse number 37, because there's something I want to say right here. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. Same thing as his brother Jehoahaz. He's doing the same sins that Manasseh had done. We're going to look here in a second. That the Bible talks about that God is judging Judah because of the sins of Manasseh. Well, guess what? It's because Jehoiakim and his younger brother who served before him, Jehoahaz, they were doing the same sins. I'll read that to you in a minute in Jeremiah. But they were doing the same. They were doing the same sins. And so because of that, God wasn't just judging because of the sins of Manasseh. He was judging because the people of Judah at this time, even though he had given them the greatest opportunity they'd ever had to get right with God because of Josiah and how Josiah cleaned the kingdom up, they had no greater opportunity than that right there, and yet they rejected that. As soon as they brought in their new king, they rejected that and went right back to their evil ways. And so now you have Jehoiakim, and for 8 years he was under Pharaoh Necho's reign, but he never sought God in those 8 years. Then Nebuchadnezzar comes up, and for 3 years he's under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And I don't know what changed where he said, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. I think he's only taken over basically the world. He's only whipped the world. But you know what? There's been some times in Judah's history where Judah won a battle they shouldn't have won. But he had forsaken the God. He had forsaken the God of Judah. He had forsaken his God and thought, how is Judah, little old Judah, going to win this battle against the king of Babylon, who's basically taking over the world, when he's also forsaken his God? That was the secret sauce to Israel and Judah winning the battles that they won. The secret sauce was, hey, their God is the one true God, the biggest, baddest God in the universe. And so whenever God is on your side and God's fighting for you, it doesn't matter who you're fighting against, you're going to win the battle. But he said, I don't need you, God. I don't need you. I'll be just fine. I'll be just fine without you, and I'm gonna rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. But look what happens in verse number 2. It's not Nebuchadnezzar. It's the Lord he's fighting against. In verse number 2, it says, and the Lord sinned against him. It's the Lord that he's fighting against. Again, he's like, hey, I'm going to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. And again, sometimes God puts things in people's hearts. Sometimes God puts things in people's hearts. And so he's like, hey, you know what? I'm gonna let him rebel. I'm going to let him rebel because I'm about to teach him a lesson. And it says, and the Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldees, and bands of the Syrians, and bands of the Moabites, and bands of the children of Ammon. Now, so again, here is God sending against Judah people who were sworn enemies of them. They were sworn enemies of them. And many, many times they fought against the Moabites. Many, many times they fought against the Ammonites. Many, many, many times they fought against the Syrians. And God had defeated the Ammonites for them, the Syrians for them, the Moabites for them. But this time God was fighting against them and not for them. God was fighting against them and not for them. And because he was fighting against them and not for them, guess what? You're not defeating the Chaldees. You're not defeating the Ammonites. You're not defeating the Moabites. You're not defeating any of those people that God sent against you. Why? Because God sent them against you. In verse 3 it says, surely, surely at the commandment of the Lord came this upon Judah. They're like, there's no question about this. There's no question. This cannot be questioned. Surely at the commandment of the Lord, God, this came upon Judah to remove them out of his sight. For the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he did, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now, let's turn back. You don't have to turn back, but I'm going to turn back to Jeremiah chapter number 22, and I'm going to read in verse number 13 now. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and by his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. That saith, I will build me a wide house, and large chambers, and cutteth him out windows, and it is sealed with cedar and painted with vermilion. Shalt thou reign because thou closest thyself in cedar? Did not thy father eat and drink and do judgment and justice, and then it was well with him? So again, here is God speaking to Jehoiakim. It's God speaking to Jehoiakim through Jeremiah and telling him, hey, your father ate, he drank, but he did judgment and justice, and it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and the needy, then it was well with him. Was not this to know me, saith the Lord? But thine eyes and thine heart are not but for thy covetousness, and for to shed innocent blood. Now, what did we read back there? It said in verse number 4, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Again, when you read the previous verse, he's talking about Manasseh. But it says Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim did all the sins that their fathers had done. And so here you read where God said, but thine eyes and thine heart are not but for thy covetousness, and for to shed innocent blood, for the oppression and for violence to do it. These men had a terrible heart. They had an evil heart. They had a wicked heart. Look in verse number 18. Therefore thus saith the Lord concerning Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, thou shalt not lament for him, saying, Ah, my brother, or Ah, sister. They shall not lament for him, saying, Ah, Lord, or Ah, his glory. Look at what he says in verse 19. He shall be buried with the burial of an ass, drawn and cast forth beyond the gates of Jerusalem. It says, hey, we're not even going to put him in a grave. You know, how many times have we read when we've been studying through these kings where they put them in a sepulcher, but the sepulcher that they put them in, they put them in the king's, the king's sepulcher, or they put them in that kind of sepulcher. But a lot of times, if they were a bad king, they would just bury him, but they wouldn't put him in the sepulcher of the kings. But this one right here, Jehoiakim, they said, hey, they're not even going to bury him. They're going to do the same thing they would do to a donkey. They're going to take that thing out, and they're just going to take that body out and just throw that body out and say, we'll let the birds deal with this. And that's what the people of the land did to Jehoiakim. Why? Because when he had an opportunity to repent, when he had an opportunity to get right with God, he said, I don't need you, God. And because of that, God sent the Chaldees, God sent the Ammonites and the Moabites, God sent those people against him to destroy Judah because of their sin. Thank y'all.